Welcome to MBL Global's Making Better Living series. In these interviews, you'll hear from senior professionals in both the insurance and mental health fields about the importance of early intervention in preventing severe mental health issues and the emerging field of psychological rehabilitation as an integral part of an insurance product offering. We'll discuss the corporate social responsibility, brand, claims and sales issues involved when insurance products are enhanced to rehabilitate people, not just buildings and balance sheets.
Hello everybody and welcome to MBL TV. Today I am delighted to be joined by Harry Salmon, Terrorism Underwriter at CFC, and his colleague Alexander Beaton, who's the K&R underwriter, also from CFC. Gentlemen, great to have you on the channel.
Great to be here. Thanks, Graeme.
As we enter a new year, there is always plenty to talk about, and 2022 is no exception. Harry and Alexander are joining me today to discuss, amongst other things, recent developments and ramifications for insurers following the consultative process outlined by the Home Secretary last week under the Protect Duty or Martyn's Law initiative, a look at the global threat environment and where they believe the likely hotspots are likely to be, their view on how insurers can be more effective in the psychological rehabilitation of victims following events, and I'll also be getting their view on how they believe products in their respective markets are likely to develop over the coming year. So, gentlemen, perhaps we could possibly start with a particularly topical subject right now, which is the Protect Duty or Martyn's Law, and if I could throw it open to you to perhaps give me an idea of what you believe it means for PV and K&R customers.
Sure. I suppose just to give the listeners an idea really of what Martyn's Law is, or the Protect Duty. So it's been born out of the Manchester Arena bombing in 2017 and was named after a young gentleman who passed away in the attack called Martyn. And his family, particularly his mother, have campaigned for venues to do more when it comes to preventing future terrorist events. So to give the proposal its formal name as the Protect Duty, as you rightly said, really what this does, it just means any space which provides public access will have a legal duty to provide specific security plans for a terrorism event. So what we have, perhaps for a lot of business for the very first time, is then really thinking about terrorism and the risk to their space for the first time.
Okay, I mean, and Alexander, do you see this falling across at all into your space, in the K&R space?
In a kind of tangible way, not really. Martyn's Law, it's specifically to do with terrorism, and one of the first things to note about a kidnap and ransom insurance policy is that it's not really designed for terrorism, essentially because everyone, not just insurers, the whole world, we're under the international sanctions regimes which are in place, and one of the key sections of that is that we can't fund terrorism. So if there were to be a kidnap incident which was perpetrated by a terrorist, firstly, it's probably unlikely they'd be asking for a ransom. They want to make a point more than they want to earn money, which means there's no ransom for us to pay. So insurers are limited in what they can do. The second element is that if there were to be a financial ransom demand, no one is allowed to pay it because that would count as funding terrorism. What Martyn's Law, I think, really does mean for the kidnap and ransom market is it's a really solid step towards placing a duty of care on people to take responsibility for these sort of things, especially when it comes to kidnapping in the past, where there have been court cases or basically any kind of legal proceedings surrounding a kidnap and who's responsible for it, and whether employers or the hosts of a venue owe a duty of care. There's never been a legal precedent established. There's, apart from a handful of cases in other jurisdictions. In the UK in particular, if there have been cases, they've been settled out of court, which means that there's no solid legal route for these things. Martyn's Law is a concrete step which shows that there is a responsibility, and it more just means that we need to look at what's going to happen in the future and whether this kind of route will continue eventually to lead into things like kidnap incidents, extortion incidents, and a whole manner of bad things that can happen to people, whether they're in the course of their employment, whether they're at a public event similar to the Manchester Arena attacks, and when that becomes the responsibility of the hosters of the event.
So, great, thanks very much, Alexander. That makes perfect sense. So, and Harry, perhaps if I could throw this one to you, do you think this duty to protect that's going to be placed on locations, on businesses, employers and so forth is going to have an impact perhaps on premiums that might be likely to be paid, in terms of costs that might need to be passed on, in terms of sort of front-end risk management, back-end risk management?
So I think that it's certainly, like Alexander correctly said, will affect the terrorism market more directly than it will the K&R sphere. And the part of the market that it really will likely impact is the liability market. In terms of traditional terrorism policies, historically they've been focused on bricks and mortar and balance sheets, as we say, and a stereotypical terrorism policy will cover property damage and any subsequent business interruption, and perhaps won't think of the human element, which is what the protect duty is really sort of shining a light on. So at the moment, employers' liability will cover terrorist incidents as standard, but it's generally sublimited to somewhere around 5 million, and that'll be similar with the public liability cover as well. So I think if we take the Manchester Arena incident and think about possible legal action coming out of it and compensation costs that might be paid, what you might now have are policyholders looking to purchase limits that are in excess or higher than the limits that are currently available in the liability market. I think this burden is more likely to fall on the terrorism market rather than the liability market. Whether it impacts premiums is kind of yet to be seen. The terrorism market has historically always been soft, and incidents like Borough Market, for example, generally don't have a tangible impact on premiums. But I definitely think it will make insurers think more about the cover they're offering and extend that cover outside just of the stereotypical property damage and business interruption, to think about the liability aspects that might occur if companies are seen to fall short in their duty to protect.
So, I mean, is there an educational role that insurers can play with their customers, with their insured clients, to inform, pre-acceptance about some of the duty, and that might be, physical changes to the premises, for example? I mean, is there a role that insurers can play in that space?
I think so, yeah. I think insurers should be at the forefront of educating prospective policyholders about why they might be buying the product and how they can prevent or at least mitigate a potential terrorism incident. I think there are a few things that came out of the Manchester Arena case. It was also with things like, for example, there was a blind spot, which is where the perpetrator generally spent his time before the attack happened. He'd also visited the arena 3 or 4 times in the build-up to the attack, and that hadn't been spotted by anyone. And also there was discussion around whether the security perimeter should have been pushed further out, and whether this perhaps would have dissuaded the terrorist involved if the security perimeter had been further away from the arena itself. So I definitely think insurers have a role to play, definitely in helping educate policyholders.
I think just going on from what Harry said, I think it's really important in lines of business such as kidnap, ransom and terror insurance. These are really critical types of insurance. Without wanting to sound overly melodramatic, if things go wrong with these insurance, people's lives are at stake. So when we get something coming in that things don't seem right, it's really important for us to be able to speak up and say, go away, consider these things, because we want to provide a product that will actually provide a service to people. We want to solve an entire incident. We want to make sure this whole thing, top to bottom, is wrapped up and done correctly. And I'm not saying that other areas of insurance don't feel that way, but I think that just when really lives do become at stake in these areas, it's even more important.
Sure. I mean, I think there's definitely, from our perspective, there's definitely we see a role that insurers can play to ensure that premises and people and the staff within the premises are educated to a certain extent in terms of how to do this, and perhaps and we'll see what 2022 brings, but a situation where we could see the insurance product ensuring a higher degree of fit for purpose, if you like, within that environment. So it'll be an interesting thing to see how things progress. And Alexander, you were talking earlier about sort of jurisdictions and so on, and I'm just wondering perhaps what a CFC view would be on whether you see this type of duty not just perhaps moving from the UK, terrorist risk written in the UK, to perhaps terror risk and even indeed other risks written outside of the UK. I mean, could you see this being a thin end of a wedge, perhaps?
Well, excuse me. I think so. I think in many areas we're already en route for things like this. There's a couple of cases which I know of, which, as I said earlier, there have only been a few kind of bona fide legal precedents set. And there was one that was in relation to the Virginia Tech shooting in the United States, which I believe was 2007, where quite a large award was made to the families of two of the victims, on the basis that the university didn't actually set its emergency response procedure in progress in time, and if they had, then more lives could have been saved. So a similar kind of idea to what we're seeing under Martyn's law now. And of course that is all to do with evacuating the buildings and getting the area safe, which isn't a big jump away from one of the elements we cover under a kidnap insurance policy, which is emergency evacuation due to outbreak of war or conflict and things like that. So we've seen it in a few jurisdictions already. When it comes to happening in other parts of the world, under a kidnap and ransom policy, the responsibility will lie with the policyholder. It's not really to do with the country that they're in, it's to do with the country where they're being sent from. And many of the entities we will be covering will, for instance, if we're covering individuals in Iraq, it's pretty unlikely there's going to be an Iraqi company. It's more likely to be European, North American, things like that. So it's the countries where we're likely to be affected are already doing these sort of things, as we're seeing through Martyn's law, as we're seeing through that judgment to the US. Whether it's going to spread into the local legislation in these areas, which are of a higher risk, I mean, we'll see there. They are typically kind of less robust legally in some areas, and the law can be a little bit more quiet. But hopefully it will. It's a good law. It's a good progress that we should be supporting.
Yeah, I mean, it's just sort of from our perspective, we're not directly involved. I mean, obviously our product supports the insurer's product in terms of the human rehab, but we've seen even just over the last couple of weeks this piquing the interest, for example, of event insurers, and just looking to see, again, passing on this duty, perhaps in the UK, to from a legislative sort of perspective, to be forced to take more care rather than sort of perhaps just notionally show that they have, and I can think not necessarily in the UK, but some recent events in the US that they've had some big issues at events with stage collapses, fires, and so on and so forth, leading to large losses of life. And so we'll be following this story obviously quite closely over the course of 2022, and I'm sure we'll be speaking to you guys again more on this as the year goes on. But again, perhaps a question to you both, on more of a sort of a global perspective. We're talking about, perhaps the migration of these types of initiatives moving into other locations, which probably leads me into our sort of second area of conversation, which is where you think sort of the global threats are likely to emerge over the course of the coming year and why. And perhaps I could just throw that very wide question to the pair of you.
Yeah, well, I think from a K&R perspective, which I'd imagine touches on terror as well, and Harry can elaborate on that. One of the key areas we're looking at is that there are a number of national elections in some pretty fraught environments in the upcoming 12 months. So from a K&R perspective, Nigeria is arguably one of the K&R hotspots in the world, probably the biggest one. They've got their presidential elections coming up, which is always an interesting time. In Nigeria, essentially, anyone can stand to be president. So the last election, I think they're in a region of 70 candidates, and some of them are not quite as reputable as you would hope a presidential candidate might be, and they might get some of their funding from quite illicit sources, kidnap amongst them. So we, around the previous few elections in Nigeria, there has been an uptick in kidnap incidents. A lot of Central American countries, Honduras, Nicaragua, they've got elections. Brazil, Venezuela, Libya, even in the US, there's the midterms coming up, and the US being quite a divided country right now. When we're in the middle of an era like we are now with COVID and with economic insecurity, any kind of added instability and division that comes into an environment where people are already quite riled up is always just going to create a bit of a perfect storm, which leads to instability, crime, and events like kidnap and those kind of criminal things that we're looking to cover. So that's one of the more general things we're looking at right now. Outside of that, there are always going to be little incidents that pop up. The evacuation of Afghanistan last year was something that I think a lot of people saw coming, but not in the way that it did happen, which took everyone by surprise.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Harry, would you want to add anything to that before?
Like Alexander, I think for the PV market, democracy or a lack thereof will be a real key issue in 2022. 2021 was a good year for a coup. There were, I think, 5 successful coups, and we've definitely started to see an increase in sort of military intervention if we think of issues in countries like Myanmar and Sudan. Of course, the pandemic has caused virtually all economies to shrink and an increase in socio-economic issues like poverty or inflation. So these will be really key and hotly contested elections as governments try to recover from the pandemic. Elections have always been a hotbed and a time for increased civil unrest, but sort of for those reasons previously mentioned, it does feel like the chance of civil unrest is possibly higher than ever before. I think when lockdowns first hit, we did see a sort of quieting down in cases of civil unrest as people were forced inside, and there was that lack of movement of people. What you do have, those grievances are still there, and people have had time to stay at home and stew on them, and perhaps be radicalised further through things like the dark web. And then you've also got new issues arising as economies fail, etc. So you've got all this sort of tension that's been built up by people who now there is slightly more movement, and as sort of government subsidies might be relaxed, people are ready to kind of express their views. I think another sort of thing we're watching carefully in the PV market is kind of the general rejection of vaccine mandates or general vaccination scepticism, and this has been an interesting one because it has affected territories across the globe, and territories perhaps that we wouldn't have previously expected to have had levels of civil unrest. I'm thinking of the Netherlands, for example. We saw issues in Rotterdam not so long ago, and just last week in Bulgaria, anti-vaccine protesters attempted to storm Parliament in Sofia. So we'll definitely be keeping a close eye on that as well.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And as I was saying to you before we started the interview, as we're doing the interview, I'm online now from South Africa, and South Africa's an interesting one, both from a PV, terror, and a K&R perspective. Very high profile in the news very recently here was the kidnap of 4 brothers in Polokwane, the Moti brothers, where the police were actually interdicted from being involved in the matter. The whole case was dealt with by a UK security company. There was a large ransom paid, and I know that and the family have actually since relocated back to Dubai. So kidnap is in South Africa is very high profile, and certainly from a PV and terror perspective, with the civil unrest that took place in South Africa last year, which we were directly involved in. We had quite a significant exposure to that over the course of July last year, and again, that's one of those places where I don't think and I spend a lot of my time in South Africa, we ever actually expected that kind of situation to take place in South Africa. It's unheard of, and certainly in the terror markets, in the PV markets, South Africa was always regarded as being relatively low risk. I think if you're exposed to PV and terror, and I guess K&R as well, in South Africa, it's become significantly more high risk over the last couple of years. I don't know if you guys would agree with that from your exposure.
Definitely, I think South Africa was a shining example of how any territory can be affected, and just recently we've seen the issues in Kazakhstan, and that was following the break of the Soviet Union, was seen as one of the kind of shining lights of stability in that part of the world, and what started as fairly small-scale protests against an increase in fuel prices, sort of broke into full civil war. So I think the pandemic and the fact that virtually all economies are struggling and people have their views on whether their governments have responded appropriately really does mean the kind of world is as fragile as perhaps it's ever been, and all territories are at threat of unrest breaking out.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point, Harry. I mean, that probably leads us sort of again into, insurance markets, underwriters having to evolve to onboard a changing social and political landscape. I mean, and I guess by definition that probably means to some extent we'll see a change of product design, possibly. An evolution of products as time goes on. I mean, what's your view from a CFC perspective in your own markets around how you may see products developing over the course of the next year or so?
I feel that on the K&R side, the product is far more evolved than a lot of people expect. And I actually, this might sound a bit kind of backwards looking, but I don't think there's much more that we can do. In areas where we could broaden the product are probably areas we don't want to broaden it into. I think the real kind of innovation that we need to show on the K&R side of things is to actually communicate to people what we can do and what we are covering. I actually think that the kind of title of this product being kidnap and ransom insurance is a bit of a misnomer, because the kidnap section is probably one of the lower likelihood events that's going to happen under the policy. We also cover extortion. We cover disappearance. So if an insured person vanishes without explanation for 36 hours, the policy will kick in and they'll have the services response consultant to look for them. There are extensions available for threats which are made, for stalking, for hostage crises, for express kidnapping, which is a type of thing you see quite a lot in Latin America, is kind of the heartland of express kidnapping, which is essentially where you pick someone up and drive them around and force them to take out cash and things like that. It's almost a kind of aggravated mugging over a prolonged period. but all sorts of things like that are covered under the policy. Whereas I think people will tend to look at the marketing info saying kidnap insurance and go, well, I'm not going to be kidnapped. Well, you might not be. You might be. So still, consider buying a policy, because if you've got a low risk of kidnap, it's very cheap. But it's all the other bits that are more valuable. So I think in terms of the innovation of the product, we need to communicate that we are covering these things. And then after those things happen, what we're going to carry on covering in terms of the breadth of medical expenses, post-incident expenses. One of the big products we write here at CFC on the kidnap side, we do kind of traditional land kidnapper ransom. We also do marine kidnapper ransom for acts of piracy. And a key element under there is that after a claim is resolved, we are, in cases, we are willing to pay for a kidnap victim to be retrained. If they don't want to go back to sea, if they're just not happy with it anymore, we'll pay for their retraining within reason into another industry so they can go and find employment elsewhere, which is a fantastic perk that, a lot of people don't realise is there. One final element on the same kind of thing in terms of the breadth of what can be claimed under this policy, and this is not any sort of guarantee of what we will pay. It might not even be a true story, but there is a kind of urban legend that goes around the market of back in the kind of heyday of Somali piracy, when millions upon millions were being paid out for instance. There's the myth that a kidnap victim at the end of his rest and rehabilitation period claimed for a 2-week trip to Disney World with his family, which I like the idea that was paid, because what's a £10,000 trip to Disney on top of £30 million of K&R claim. So whether or not that's true, it's definitely in the spirit of what I think the policy is trying to do. We're trying to really put people back on their feet. So yeah, like I said, I think the product has been innovated. We just need to make sure people know that, because it's not just for high risk environments. It's for every environment, whether things can get high risk or whether it's just an incidental spurt, something that goes wrong.
Okay, so I mean the big takeout for me there is communication. I mean, clearly.
Absolutely, yeah.
And Harry, anything to add on that?
Sure. I think if we go back to where we began talking about Martyn's law on the protect duty, I think for the UK terror market, what it will get insurers thinking about is this liability element. Like I said previously, traditional terrorism policies have been focused on the property damage and subsequent business interruption, and really it's been left to your EL and PL markets to pick up any liability arising out of a terrorist incident. What this will do, I think, is shift terrorism insurers to think about it themselves, and whether they should step in and provide much bigger limits than the liability market is currently offering. So I think that's probably the biggest impact on the UK terrorism market. If we look at somewhere like the US, liability cover has almost comes as standard, and that might be something that the private terrorism market needs to think about doing as well. And in terms of sort of CFC product that is particularly people focused, we have an active assailant or active shooter product that we sell largely exclusively to North America. And what that does is really tackle this element of the human cost of such incidents. And it's likely that someone who shoots up a school or a restaurant, for example, the property damage might be quite limited, but the real victims are going to be the people involved. And this policy was created with the idea of how the people are the victims and how they can be helped going forward. So that policy will cover everything from initial incident response costs, things like victim compensation, like Alexander said earlier about the K&R product. We've also got cover to provide for psychiatric help for those involved, or retraining as well. And it might be that the UK market start to think about those sort of covers as well, in light of what we're seeing with Martyn's law and the protect duty.
Yeah, I mean that. I mean, just on that specific point, I mean, we've had a number of incidences in the US, for example. So obviously from an MBL perspective, our focus is on, and we're quite evangelical, I suppose, around the psychological rehabilitation of those affected. I think to your point earlier, Alexander, you were talking about it's not just about the balance sheets, and one of our sayings within NBL, not dissimilar to yours, is it's not just about buildings and balance sheets, it's about people. This whole issue around Protect Duty arose from the Ariana Grande concert, and whether you're looking at a shooting in the US or a concert in Manchester, what's often consistent post these events is that there is no industrial scale coordination of psychological rehabilitation following the event. Even in Manchester, nobody can actually tell you, even today, how many people were affected, how long it took them to become rehabilitated, what the ethnicity, what the age group of those people that were affected was. And this, we think, is a real piece that the industry is missing. And I think, certainly from our perspective, we're hoping that the Protect Duty will drive people to think more proactively, as you've mentioned, Harry, and that's great. That there is this piece that looks after the victims at the end of it. Because you can put the asset back up or replace the asset, but the people can take months, even years, to become properly rehabilitated. And that's not just the employees of the business, that's everybody in the vicinity. And for a terror policy, our involvement typically is somewhere in the region of about sort of 300 to 500 metres away from the event. So if you're there, we'll coordinate that counselling for everybody. So, I think it's great that this, albeit in a small way across other markets, but at least it's getting people to start to think about the human cost. So I think that's great. Absolutely,
and I think, thankfully, terrorism incidents are few and far between here in the UK. But following the incident at Liverpool Women's Hospital, the threat level was once again been raised to severe, and that really does speak to the fact that policyholders really do need to think about how they might respond, in the event of a terrorist incident. And while these incidents are thankfully few and far between, they do happen, and the Protect Duty will really make sure these sort of public spaces are thinking about how they could be suitably prepared.
Okay, gents, that's been great. It's been great to talk to you. Alexander and Harry, is there anything else you'd like to add to the conversation?
No, I think we've had a good chat and then really got over some issues. Nothing else from me. Just thanks so much for your time.
Yep, same here. Thanks very much for having us, Graeme.
That's great. Been great to have you on board, guys. So Alexander Beaton, Harry Salmon from CFC, good to have you on the channel, and look forward to speaking to you soon.
Thanks, Graeme.
Cheers, Graeme. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Please get in touch with us if you'd like to know more about the services we provide, or leave a review if you have any questions or feedback. See you next time.